The dawn broke pale over the ridges, spilling a cold, muted light across the jagged spines of the mountains. Frost clung to the grass, brittle and silvered, crunching under every careful step. She moved along the narrow dirt path, her coat pulled tight around her, a barrier against both wind and the emptiness that had settled into her chest. Each breath came in little puffs, visible, fragile, fading into the mist. She paused at the crest of a small rise, letting her eyes trace the horizon, the way the ridges dipped and rose again, endless and indifferent. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, the quiet broken only by the distant cry of a hawk or the faint rattling of a loose tin roof somewhere down the slope. Her boots were scuffed and stiff, the soles worn thin. She pressed her palms together, rubbing them over the fabric of her gloves, but the warmth never came. There was a faint ache in her shoulders, a memory of labor and struggle that had nothing to do with work itself and everything to do with loss. Money lost, trust misplaced, the slow collapse of a life she had once imagined for herself. She had come here, to this forgotten corner of the mountains, because it was all she could afford, all that remained unclaimed by debts and the whispers of neighbors who had long stopped offering comfort. A fence, long abandoned, marked the boundary of a neighboring pasture. Rust streaked its rails, and a few boards had splintered under the weight of time. She reached out, resting her hand on one of the cold posts, feeling its roughness beneath her fingers, the grit of years pressed into the wood. She could almost hear the echoes of a different life in it, a life where someone had leaned here before her, maybe a child with scraped knees, maybe a farmer counting the day's small victories. She sighed, a quiet, wind-borne sound, and let her eyes drift across the valley, where mist clung low and distant shapes of trees seemed to float like ghosts. Her wallet had just enough for gas and groceries, barely enough to consider anything beyond survival. And yet, she had paused over an old, faded ad scribbled onto a piece of cardboard and nailed to a post in town. Wild mountain horse, $200. The letters had been smudged by rain, but the message had stayed in her mind like a spark she couldn't ignore. $200. Almost nothing, but a life could hinge on the smallest spark, and she had begun to wonder if perhaps this ragged creature, forgotten and scorned, could give her a reason to hope again. The path led her to a low barn, half hidden behind a bend in the ridge. Its roof sagged, shingles missing, doors cracked in the frame. She stopped before it, taking in the smell of old hay, dust, and something wilder beneath it all, a scent of something untamed, something not yet broken by the world. Her hand hovered over the latch, hesitant, the weight of the choice pressing down like the frost on the ground. She had come here knowing nothing, only that she was drawn, that she could not leave without seeing what waited inside. The barn door groaned as she pushed it open, sunlight slicing through the cracks in the boards, scattering across the dirt floor in gold dust motes. A horse stirred in the shadows, a faint snort, a flick of ears that twitched nervously. She froze, eyes adjusting to the gloom. It was thin, its coat matted, a mixture of gray and brown that seemed to blend with the barn itself. Its ribs showed faintly beneath the tangled hair, and a scar ran along its left shoulder, pale against the darker fur. The horse regarded her with wide, wary eyes, nostrils flaring, every muscle taut. She stood still, letting her presence be small and unthreatening. The silence was long, stretched between them like the space between heartbeats. She could see the shiver running down its spine, the tense curve of its neck, the way it shifted its weight from hoof to hoof. And in that moment, she recognized something in herself reflected there. Wariness, a bruised pride, a cautious hope that dared not yet speak aloud. Outside, the wind rattled the barn walls, and she felt the chill creep through her coat. She pulled a small piece of stale bread from her pocket, tearing it into fragments. Her fingers shook slightly as she held it out, palm upward. The horse's ears flicked, then slowly, deliberately, it stepped closer, each movement measured, as though testing the truth of her intentions. She whispered something under her breath, a sound more of reassurance to herself than a promise to the creature. She thought about the neighbors who would have laughed at the idea of her buying this ugly horse, the ones who believed she was too fragile, too inexperienced, too exhausted to care for anything that demanded more than herself. She thought of the months of silence in her small cabin, the evenings spent watching the fire burn low, the hunger for purpose gnawing more than any lack of food. And yet, here in the dusty half-light of the barn, she felt a fragile, flickering possibility. It was not a moment of sudden triumph. There was no grand revelation, no fireworks of hope. Just a quiet, careful step forward, the hand extended, the heart daring to believe that connection could exist even in the coldest places. She would take it home. She would feed it, tend it, speak to it as though the world had never failed it. And perhaps, in turn, it might teach her to trust again. She drew a slow, steadying breath, inhaling the scent of hay, dust, and something wild that made her pulse quicken. She glanced back toward the ridge, toward the valley below, and the frozen horizon seemed less empty than before, as though the mountains themselves had shifted slightly to make room for this new possibility. She reached for the rope lying coiled on the floor and knelt, her shadow long against the barn wall, offering the horse a tentative loop. The creature snorted again, muscles trembling, nostrils quivering, and then, in a small, almost imperceptible gesture, it stepped closer still. The choice had been made without fanfare. She would buy this horse, give it a chance, and in doing so, she might just give herself a chance as well. She could not know what lay ahead, the trials that would test patience and courage, the strangers who would appear, demanding attention, judgment, and resolution. But in this moment, she felt the fragile thrill of purpose, the first pulse of connection, the quiet insistence that small acts could matter, even in a world that had seemed determined to withhold mercy. Some lessons come only to those willing to step into the unknown. She stood, dusting off her hands, watching the horse shift its weight under the muted morning light. And though the road ahead was uncertain, the first step had been taken. The barn was still, the mountains stretched beyond, and somewhere beneath the frost and wind, a spark had been lit that neither she nor the horse could yet fully understand. But both would follow, one careful step at a time. The barn smelled of dry hay, dust, and something older, something stubborn that had survived neglect and winter storms. She knelt on the rough wooden floor, the rope coiled loosely in her hands, watching the horse with cautious fascination. Its ears flicked sideways, nostrils flaring with each shallow breath, eyes wide and untrusting. She could see the tremble of its muscles under a coat that had known both cold nights and empty feed troughs. The creature had been alone too long, and its vigilance was a language she recognized, one she had learned to speak in silence. She extended a hand again, smaller fragments of bread resting on her palm. The horse shifted its weight, one hoof scraping the dirt, and let out a soft snort. A faint hiss of air escaped its nostrils, and for a moment she thought it might bolt. Her heartbeat quickened, not with fear but with anticipation, the fragile line between connection and retreat. She spoke in a low, even voice, words almost lost in the barn's shadowed corners. "It's all right. You're safe." Not command, not pleading, just a quiet truth offered in the hope that it could be heard. Outside, the wind rattled the loose boards of the barn, sending dust motes swirling in the shafts of morning light. She smelled pine and earth carried in on the breeze. A bird called somewhere beyond the ridge, a sharp note that made the horse flinch, ears swiveling to catch every sound. She did not move, did not flinch herself, letting the creature judge her by presence alone. Slowly, it lowered its head, nostrils brushing the bread, and she felt the slightest exhalation of trust, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. Kneeling there, she remembered the dog she had once had as a child, a small brown thing that had followed her everywhere, and then vanished in a summer of family strife she had been too young to understand. She thought of the neighbors' warnings about this horse. "It's wild. No one tames it. You'll waste your money." Yet, as the creature's lips grazed the crumbs in her palm, she felt a quiet defiance swell within her. Maybe some connections weren't meant to be easy. Maybe trust was earned, step by step, breath by breath. She reached slowly for the rope, looping it around her fingers with a careful hand. The horse recoiled slightly, ears flattening, muscles coiled like a drawn bow. She paused, letting her presence settle over it like a blanket of still air. "I won't hurt you," she whispered. The horse sniffed the air, its large eyes following her every motion. Then, in a deliberate act of surrender, it stepped closer, the rope brushing lightly against its neck. She let the line go slack, letting it feel freedom in the tether, even as it accepted restraint. Time stretched in the barn, measured in small gestures. A tremor of the tail, the soft clatter of a hoof against the dusty floor, the rhythm of breathing that seemed to match her own. The wind outside softened, sunlight drifting across the walls and landing in golden rectangles on the horse's matted coat. Each detail became a marker of understanding. The way its muscles relaxed fractionally, the subtle lowering of its head, the tentative sniffing at her sleeve. It was a conversation without words, carried in the language of presence and patience. She thought of the empty kitchen table at home, the bills stacked like quiet judgments in the corner, the nights spent staring at a ceiling that offered nothing but the passage of time. Here, in the barn, she had purpose, a life to protect, a creature to nurture. She realized the horse's fear mirrored her own, of loss, of disappointment, of giving too much to a world that often demanded too little. And in acknowledging that, she felt a bond forming, tenuous yet unbreakable in its honesty. For the first time in months, she laughed softly, a sound swallowed immediately by the barn's thick timbers. The horse shifted, startled, ears swiveling, but did not retreat. It had learned, perhaps instinctively, that her intentions were steady, that her hand would not strike, that her voice carried calm rather than command. The moment crystallized. Trust was fragile, but could be built painstakingly, with nothing but time and steadfast presence. By late morning, she had led the horse out of the barn and into the small paddock behind her cabin. The grass was thin, frost still lingering in patches, but the horse trotted carefully, nostrils flaring, tail flicking nervously. She followed at a measured pace, rope slack, allowing it to explore, to test the limits of safety she offered. Every step revealed a nuance. A flick of the ears toward the ridge, a wary glance at the fence, a hesitant paw raised, then set down with deliberate caution. Neighbors passing along the ridge glanced curiously at the ragged pair. Some smiled, others shook their heads at what they considered folly. She ignored them, her attention fixed entirely on the horse. With every careful approach, every quiet word, every shared fragment of bread or handful of hay, she felt a tether forming that was more than rope, a mutual recognition of survival, of resilience, of need. By noon, she sat on the ground, the horse grazing near her, muscles coiled in readiness yet easing slowly. Its flank brushed against her leg, a tentative contact that spoke of trust gained. She rested her hand on its neck, feeling the warmth beneath the tangled fur, and understood in a way she hadn't in months that connection could be a lifeline. She had offered care, and the world had replied, not with grandeur, not with immediate reward, but with something subtler, acknowledgement, recognition, and the slow opening of a heart long closed. As shadows lengthened across the paddock, she realized that the horse had changed something in her. She felt lighter, her chest less burdened by the monotony of loss. Yet there remained a whisper of tension in the air, a sense that the world beyond this small enclosure would not leave them untouched. The thought of strangers, of claimants, of forces indifferent to the bond they were forming, hung faintly in the wind. She did not fear, exactly. She only recognized that kindness required courage, that commitment meant perseverance, even when the outcome was uncertain. The horse shifted again, lifting its head to regard her with dark, intelligent eyes. She smiled faintly, brushing a hand along its neck, and in that moment, both of them acknowledged the promise of what lay ahead. It was a fragile promise, unspoken, contingent upon patience and steadfastness. But it was enough to propel her forward, enough to spark the quiet thrill of possibility that had been absent for far too long. She stood, brushing dust from her coat, her gaze sweeping the ridge and valley beyond. The wind had softened to a whisper, carrying the scent of pine and earth. Somewhere, a bird called again, sharp and insistent, and the horse's ears twitched in response. Together, they faced the horizon, two creatures, cautious and scarred, leaning into the uncertain future with a shared, unspoken agreement. They would endure, together, step by careful step. The first choice had been made. Trust had been extended, and though the days ahead promised struggle, confrontation, and discovery, she felt the quiet surge of hope that comes when one decides, finally, to act. The mountain was vast and indifferent, but here, in the small paddock, amidst frost, dust, and the muted gold of sunlight, she had found a companion, and perhaps, for the first time in years, a reason to believe that even the smallest acts of care could ripple into something profound. Some lessons come only to those who reach across the divide of fear and doubt. She had done so, and the horse had responded. The road ahead was uncertain, and yet, in the fragile morning light, both of them knew that the journey had begun. The horse had begun to settle, its coat catching flecks of sunlight that filtered through the high, cracked windows of the barn. Yet even as it grazed, ears flicking nervously at every distant sound, the shadow of the past lingered in the air like dust that refused to settle. She had noticed the scars first, faint but deliberate, along its flanks and shoulders, a testimony to hands that had been careless, harsh, or cruel. Every step the horse took carried a history she could not yet read fully, and every glance it gave her reminded her that trust was fragile and easily shattered. The neighbors had begun to notice her presence, some offering polite questions, others casting skeptical looks. One afternoon, an older man from the ridge brought a weathered folder, the papers inside yellowed and brittle. He handed it over without much ceremony, muttering, "Thought you should know what you've gotten yourself into." She opened it carefully, as though touching the papers might disturb the truth embedded in their fibers. Photographs, veterinary notes, and a few brief letters outlined a history of neglect and hurried ownership changes. Every document painted a picture of a creature discarded, shuffled between barns and owners who had little interest in care. She ran her fingers over a photograph of the horse as a younger animal, sleek and spirited, its eyes bright and alert. The contrast to the present moment was stark. Somewhere along the way, someone had decided that convenience outweighed kindness. The thought made her chest tighten. She looked up at the barn shadows, imagining the harsh hands and hurried feet that had brought it to this state. Her gaze fell on the horse, nibbling cautiously at the sparse grass, tail flicking in measured irritation. It did not know that she had seen its past. It only knew the present moment and the caution with which it must navigate it. Days turned into weeks, and the mountain wind continued to carve its path through the ridges, indifferent to human struggles. She began keeping a journal, a quiet testament to what she observed. Subtle improvements in weight, the softening of a flinch, a willingness to approach when called. But with progress came complications. Letters arrived from previous owners, some claiming rights, others warning that she had no authority to keep the horse. A local councilman's assistant called, reminding her that permits were required for livestock in this area, that the paddock was too small by regulation, that the horse might be repossessed if she failed to comply. Each notice, each threat, reminded her that the world outside her small sanctuary did not share the same patience, the same care. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that she noticed strangers approaching along the ridge. 3 of them, their figures indistinct at first, but purposeful in movement, descending with the kind of deliberation that spoke of intent rather than chance. She felt the familiar tightening of her chest, a reminder that good intentions often collided with indifference or greed. The horse lifted its head, nostrils flaring, ears forward, sensing the intrusion before she could fully register it. Its body stiffened, a silent warning that whatever had come to her barn might carry the weight of conflict. The men arrived at the paddock's edge, voices low but firm, carrying authority she did not recognize. One held a clipboard, another a long rope, the third simply standing with arms crossed. Their questions were polite, even courteous, but each carried an underlying assumption that she had no right, no claim, and that the horse belonged elsewhere. They asked about purchase receipts, proof of ownership, and the condition of the paddock. She answered quietly, showing her documents, explaining the care she had provided, but she could sense the hesitation in their faces, the doubt that kindness alone might be insufficient in a world that often measured value in convenience or profit. Later, she examined the horse in greater detail, touching the faint ridges along its flanks, running her hand over its scarred shoulder, counting ribs that still hinted at past hunger. Each mark told a story of cruelty or neglect, yet each step forward with the horse now revealed resilience. She realized that the struggle was not just against the men or the rules or the past. It was against the world's insistence that survival demanded submission, that worth could be measured only in obedience or speed or utility. She knelt beside the creature, whispering words she barely understood herself. "We'll get through this. Together." The horse's ears twitched, its head leaning slightly against her shoulder, as if acknowledging a promise it could not yet comprehend. At night, she pored over the documents again, piecing together timelines, former owners, and the inconsistencies that suggested negligence rather than care. A pattern emerged. The horse had been a commodity, bought and sold without thought, each transaction leaving its mark in muscle memory, in reflexive fear. Her stomach tightened as she realized the weight of responsibility she had taken on. Yet amid the anxiety, a quiet determination began to take root. The horse's survival had become a moral imperative, a test of her patience, her judgment, her willingness to act in the face of uncertainty. Small victories punctuated the weeks. A flinch diminished to a twitch, a nervous snort turned into a soft nicker when she approached. She watched the creature roll in the dirt for the first time without fear, shaking off the residue of confinement and harsh hands. She allowed herself a small smile, a private acknowledgement that her persistence mattered, that care could alter trajectories if wielded steadily, without haste. And yet the tension remained. The strangers could return, the council could intervene, and the scars of the past could flare unexpectedly. The mountain held no guarantees, and the wider world offered no mercy for delayed action. One afternoon, a neighbor confided a story of the horse's previous owners, a wealthy man who had grown impatient with what he considered temperamental behavior, and an absentee farmhand who had turned cruelty into routine. The details were harsh, precise, but the effect was to illuminate the resilience already present in the creature. She looked at the horse, grazing quietly, tail swishing, ears alert but relaxed, and saw that even in the face of indifference, it had endured. She felt a kinship she had not expected. Both of them survivors, both navigating a world that often failed to recognize quiet strength. The horizon darkened with the early approach of winter clouds, and the barn took on a somber hue. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, and the horse's breath fogged before her in small, misted bursts. She ran a hand along its mane, noting the shine that had begun to return, the subtle curve of muscles regaining tone. The world outside might continue to impose rules, claims, and obstacles, but here, in this space carved by patience and persistence, she could exert a measure of control, of morality, of care. And perhaps, she thought quietly, that was the only real form of justice that mattered. By the end of the day, the strangers had left with polite warnings, their intentions unfulfilled, their authority unproven against the steady persistence of care. The horse lowered its head to the grass, chewing deliberately, ears flicking toward her with faint acknowledgement. She knelt beside it, pressing a hand against the warmth of its flank, and felt an unspoken bond deepen. It was not triumph yet, nor was it certainty, but it was a victory of persistence, a quiet testament to the power of steadfast care against a world often indifferent or cruel. She rose slowly, brushing dust from her coat, eyes lifting to the ridge and the fading light beyond. The mountains were quiet, shadows stretching long. But within the barn, warmth lingered, a mixture of dust, hay, and the fragile pulse of trust she had nurtured. Some lessons, she knew, were only revealed in confrontation with the world's indifference. And though the road ahead promised more struggle, she felt the faint thrill of possibility that comes when persistence meets resilience. The horse had survived neglect. Perhaps, she thought, it could survive this new world as well. And in that moment, as the sun slipped behind the distant peaks, she understood that the story was no longer about mere survival. It was about justice without vengeance, about compassion measured not in grand gestures, but in daily, deliberate action. The horse was no longer simply an animal. It was a mirror, reflecting the strength and patience she had begun to reclaim in herself. The strangers, the bureaucracy, the past cruelty, they were challenges to be met, not inevitable defeat. And with that understanding, she allowed herself a rare sense of calm, a quiet anticipation for the days to come, knowing that the true test of character and of care was only just beginning. The morning arrived pale and still, the mountains brushed in silver light that seeped into every crevice of the barn. She stood by the paddock gate, hands pressed lightly against the rough wood, watching the horse stir. Its coat had begun to gleam faintly, muscles softening with strength regained, yet the scars along its shoulder and flank were still visible, reminders of what had been endured. Somewhere beyond the ridge, she could hear the distant echo of a vehicle, tires crunching gravel. The strangers had returned, deliberate, purposeful. The air felt heavier, each inhalation carrying the chill of anticipation. When they arrived, 3 figures emerged from the dust, their authority unmistakable in their stance. The tallest held a clipboard, a document clipped firmly in place. The second carried a length of rope, taut and clean. The third merely observed, arms folded, eyes scanning the paddock as if weighing every detail. She met them calmly, though her stomach clenched with tension. Words were unnecessary at first. The horse sensed the disturbance, ears pricking, hooves shifting nervously, muscles coiled beneath the still sparse coat. It was a mirror of her own pulse, cautious, alert, determined. Proof of ownership. The tallest man began, voice measured, almost courteous but sharp at the edges. She reached into her coat pocket and drew the small stack of receipts, veterinary notes, and her journal, placing them carefully on the fence for inspection. The men examined each item with deliberate attention, fingers tapping on paper, eyes narrowing. She noted each gesture, each hesitation, interpreting them not as judgment, but as the measure of an obstacle she had to face. Silence stretched over the paddock, broken only by the shallow breaths of the horse, the occasional scuff of hoof against dirt, the whisper of wind through the ridge pines. The middle man stepped forward, rope in hand, gesturing toward the horse. "We're here to reclaim this animal," he said, voice low but firm. "Previous ownership is documented, and regulations require transfer." She looked at the horse, then back at the men, feeling the weight of responsibility settle like a stone across her chest. She spoke quietly, deliberately, each word measured. "It is under my care now. I have documentation of purchase and the attention it requires. I will not allow harm to come to it." There was no bravado in her tone, no anger, just unwavering certainty. The strangers exchanged glances, the kind that silently negotiate power, and then returned their attention to the documents. Hours passed in a quiet, tense examination, verification of purchase, notes on the horse's health, photographs showing its progress under her care. The horse, sensing the tension but also the steadiness of her presence, shifted its weight, ears forward but muscles relaxing fractionally. Each detail, each patient act, reinforced the silent argument she had been making from the moment she had stepped into the barn. Finally, the tallest man spoke, voice softer, tinged with reluctant acknowledgement. "You've taken care of it," he said. "Better than expected." It was not praise, exactly, but a recognition of truth she had known all along. That steadfast care could outmatch indifference, that patience could outlast authority when wielded with integrity. He gestured to the others, and though their expressions were still reserved, the threat of removal was gone. The horse shifted, lifting its head and nuzzling her shoulder, a quiet affirmation that she had prevailed without force, without coercion, without compromise of her values. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. The horse's warm flank pressed against her palm, and she felt a surge of relief, tempered with the understanding that responsibility remained. She had won this moment, but the mountain and the world beyond would continue to test the limits of care and resolve. Yet, in this victory, there was profound clarity. Justice was not the loud assertion of power, but the quiet endurance of patience and empathy. The strangers left, their tires crunching gravel down the ridge, leaving a hush in their wake. She walked the perimeter of the paddock, feeling the horse follow her in measured steps, ears attentive, nostrils quivering at every familiar scent. She examined the small scratches along its legs, the softening of ribs that had once been sharp under the coat, and realized that the quiet work of care, feeding, grooming, talking, watching, had built something impervious to casual authority. Trust. Evening fell, painting the mountains in pale orange and muted lavender. She sat on a small rock near the paddock, the horse grazing within reach, tail flicking, ears flicking, muscles relaxed but alert. The air smelled of pine resin, damp earth, and the faint warmth of the day lingering in the soil. She traced the outline of its shoulder with her hand, feeling both the scars and the strength beneath. The creature had survived cruelty, neglect, and indifference, and now, under her care, it thrived. She realized the lesson was mutual. It had taught her resilience, patience, and the quiet power of steadfastness. Her mind wandered briefly to the time before the horse, the months of solitude and quiet despair, the evenings spent staring at a ceiling that offered nothing but reflection. She thought about the letters, the strangers, the small bureaucracies that had threatened her attempts at care, and recognized that every obstacle had been a test of conviction. She had passed not by confrontation or force, but by demonstrating the simple truth that kindness, when persistent, cannot be ignored. The sky darkened into a muted cobalt, stars beginning to prick the velvet of night. She stood, brushing dust from her coat, and watched the horse settle near the edge of the paddock, nostrils flaring in the cool night air, muscles relaxing as if it, too, understood the victory of patience. A soft wind stirred the trees along the ridge, carrying the sound of distant water and the faint echo of a bird calling its mate. In that quiet, expansive moment, she understood that life, both hers and the horse's, was no longer about survival alone. It was about presence, care, and the courage to act with integrity even when the world offered little reward. Night fell fully, and she returned to her cabin, the barn behind her illuminated by the soft glow of lantern light. She paused at the door, glancing back at the paddock where the horse rested. Its silhouette, proud and calm, mirrored her own sense of regained purpose. She realized that the bond they had forged was not merely about taming a creature or asserting ownership. It was a testament to endurance, to the power of moral persistence, and to the quiet victories that define character. In the following weeks, life settled into a rhythm she had long thought impossible. The horse grew stronger, its trust in her deepened, and the mountains, once indifferent and harsh, seemed to offer a measure of acknowledgement. The air smelled fresher, the light warmer, and the silence of the ridge was no longer oppressive but companionable. Together, they walked the paths that had once been lonely, each step a dialogue of presence, each glance a reaffirmation of trust. Some lessons, she knew, were revealed only through struggle and persistence. The strangers had tested her resolve, the horse had tested her patience, and the world had tested both. Yet the outcome was not measured in victory over another, but in the restoration of something fragile and beautiful. She knelt beside the horse, hand brushing along its mane, and whispered into the cool evening, "We made it." The mountains stretched endlessly beyond, indifferent yet patient witnesses. In that quiet expanse, the bond between woman and horse held firm, resilient against the indifference of the world. She had learned, and the horse had learned, that trust could be earned slowly, that compassion required courage, and that moral truth, when demonstrated consistently, could prevail without force. Some lessons come only to those willing to step forward despite uncertainty. She rose, brushing her hands over her coat, watching the horse shift, ears flicking toward her in acknowledgement. The air was still, the mountains soft in the glow of lanterns and moonlight. A calm settled over the paddock, over the barn, over the ridge, carrying the promise of days to come. The road ahead remained uncertain, but for now, justice, patience, and care had triumphed. And in that triumph, she felt a deep, abiding fulfillment, a quiet thrill that did not shout, but resonated with the steady pulse of life reclaimed. He or she never knew how the creature found its way back from the shadow of abandonment. But perhaps, she thought, kindness leaves a trail the lost can always follow. The horse nickered softly, the sound a gentle affirmation, and she allowed herself to believe that this trust, resilience, and quiet moral courage was victory enough. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts below.